There's a certain kind of silence that happens right before a phone starts ringing. For some people, it barely registers. They answer without thinking. Their voice arrives naturally, almost automatically, like opening a door they've opened 1,000 times before. But for others, even seeing the screen light up changes something in the body. The chest tightens slightly, and the mind immediately starts searching for context before the call is even answered. What happened? Why are they calling instead of texting? How long is this going to last? And sometimes, even when the person on the screen is someone they love, they still let it ring once, maybe twice, maybe all the way to voicemail. Not because they don't care, but because something about phone calls feels strangely invasive in a way they can't fully explain. Most people misunderstand this. They assume it's rudeness, avoidance, social awkwardness, or lack of confidence. And to be fair, the world tends to treat phone calls as proof of emotional openness. If you're willing to just call, you're seen as direct, warm, and connected. If you hesitate, people often interpret it as distance. But that interpretation misses something important. For many people, avoiding phone calls isn't really about disliking people. It's about what happens internally when conversation becomes immediate, unpredictable, and emotionally exposed. And there's more going on there than most people realize. A lot of psychologists describe phone anxiety as a form of anticipatory stress. Not fear of speaking itself, but fear of entering a space with no buffer. Texting gives the nervous system time to process tone, think clearly, and regulate emotion before responding. Phone calls remove that distance entirely. Your reactions become live, your pauses become audible, and even uncertainty becomes visible through silence. For certain nervous systems, that creates a level of stimulation that feels surprisingly intense. Researchers who study social cognition have noticed that some people process interpersonal interaction more deeply than others. Not necessarily better, just more thoroughly. They pick up on subtleties faster, changes in tone, breathing patterns, and emotional shifts underneath words. The problem is that phone calls compress all of that information into real time. There's no pause button and no emotional editing. The brain has to decode and respond simultaneously. For people with more sensitive threat detection systems, that can feel exhausting before the conversation even begins, especially if they grew up in environments where communication felt unpredictable, a household where moods changed suddenly, where simple conversations could become conflict without warning, or where they learned to monitor tone carefully before speaking. In those environments, children often become highly attuned to emotional nuance because it helps them stay safe. Their nervous system adapts by becoming vigilant, fast-reading, and careful. And later in life, phone calls can unconsciously reactivate that same state. Not because the person on the other end is dangerous, but because the body remembers what unpredictability used to feel like. Even healthy conversations can trigger the old instinct to prepare for emotional impact before it arrives. That's why some people rehearse what they're going to say before making a simple call. It's why they feel relief when someone doesn't answer, and why they prefer messages even with people they deeply trust.
It isn't always social anxiety in the traditional sense. Sometimes it's nervous system management. Sometimes it's emotional pacing. And sometimes it's the result of spending years learning that immediate access to you came with emotional consequences. What's interesting is that many people who avoid phone calls are not emotionally disconnected at all. In fact, they're often unusually thoughtful communicators. They care deeply about wording, clarity, and avoiding misunderstanding. They replay conversations afterward, wondering if their tone sounded wrong or if they responded too quickly or not quickly enough, which is part of the paradox. The people who seem distant are often the ones processing connection most intensely. And modern life amplifies this even further. Human brains were never designed for constant access. A ringing phone creates urgency, interruption, and demand. Before mobile phones, communication had boundaries built into it naturally. Now, people can enter each other's emotional space instantly, at almost any moment. For some nervous systems, that constant accessibility feels draining in ways they struggle to articulate, so they delay responding, not because they don't value the relationship, but because they need a moment to transition psychologically and prepare internally before becoming socially available. And none of this means phone avoidance is superior. Some people genuinely feel more connected through voice, more alive in spontaneous conversation, more emotionally nourished by hearing someone laugh in real time instead of reading words on a screen. Neither way is more evolved or more caring. Different nervous systems simply experience intimacy through different channels. But people who avoid phone calls often carry a quiet shame about it anyway. They tell themselves they're bad at communication, too sensitive, or too difficult, especially when they compare themselves to people who can answer instantly without hesitation. What they usually don't realize is that the hesitation itself often comes from caring, from wanting to be fully present, from unconsciously understanding that conversation affects them deeply enough to require energy, regulation, and recovery. And there's another layer to this that almost nobody talks about. Many people who avoid phone calls are actually protecting a version of themselves they rarely show others. Because voice is revealing, more revealing than text. Your emotional state leaks through it. Fatigue, sadness, disappointment, or loneliness. You can hide behind well-written messages. You can revise them, shape them, and control the impression they leave behind. But a phone call exposes the unscripted self in real time. And for people who spent years learning to manage how they're perceived, that level of immediacy can feel deeply vulnerable, even intimate, sometimes too intimate for ordinary moments. Which explains why some people can spend hours writing thoughtful paragraphs but still struggle to answer a 2-minute call. Not because they lack social ability, but because different forms of communication activate different forms of exposure. And strangely, many of these same people become incredibly calm once the conversation actually starts. The anxiety lives mostly in the anticipation, the transition, the uncertainty before contact. Because the human nervous system is often less afraid of experience itself than it is of not knowing what experience is about to arrive. That's an important distinction, especially for people who have spent much of their life adapting to unpredictability without realizing it. At some point, they stopped seeing preparation as preparation. It simply became personality. I'm just bad at calls. I'm just awkward. I'm just not a phone person. But underneath those labels, there's often a very coherent psychological story, a nervous system trying to create safety through pacing, control, and emotional predictability. And once you understand that, the behavior stops looking irrational. It starts looking human. They're not broken, immature, or cold, just human. Because every person develops their own way of managing closeness, stimulation, and emotional access. Some move toward connection quickly, while others approach it carefully. Both are understandable responses to being shaped by life. And if this feeling has followed you quietly for years, there's a good chance there are other parts of yourself that make more sense through this lens too. Patterns that once looked like flaws may actually be adaptations with a history behind them. Sometimes all it takes is seeing the pattern clearly for the shame around it to loosen a little.